daughters married or doesn't have enough to come back home and get his sons a good education, that person can be able to sleep with a full stomach. That's really the spirit of zakah. That's really the purpose of zakah. Zakah is a purification for your wealth. Whatever wealth you have, if you give zakah on it, then that becomes halal and permissible for you. So this was a basic overview of the importance of discharging zakah. With that being said, some of the topics we're going to speak about today, inshallah, will be who has to pay zakah? What kind of wealth do you have to pay zakah on? And when does that zakah have to be paid? And then at the end, inshallah, if we have an opportunity, we'll go into some of the rulings with regards to paying zakah to organizations. And then finally, we'll talk about sadaqatul fitr, inshallah. So first and foremost, whenever we talk about something, we always address it from the perspective of its definition, and we address it from the perspective of what are those integrals or what are those things which are necessary to be found in the action, and then we can expand it from there. So the definition of zakah, which is provided on the papers, is giving ownership of a specified amount of wealth. And we're going to explain what that amount of wealth is, right? 2.5%. From specified forms of wealth, right? Certain forms of wealth that you have to pay zakah on. Specifically, it's any type of wealth which has the aspect of growth within it, right? And we're going to explain what that exactly means. To specified categories of people. So we understand that we can't just take zakah and we can't spend it everywhere or do anything that we'd like with it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned in the Quran how to perform that whole action of zakah and where to spend that zakah money. And this is important for us to understand because unfortunately, this is something that organizations not only here, but around the world, or people around the world, they actively make this mistake. That they say that zakah is for the poor, and therefore I can take my money and I can spend it in however way that is benefiting the poor, or however way that I think would be appropriate. That is not the case, because we understand that the rulings with regards to zakah are specifically outlined in the Quran. And if you haven't followed that specific protocol, you haven't followed those specific rulings, then your zakah is not considered to be fulfilled. So from this definition, there's a couple things that we can specifically point out. And I specifically took these out in terms of integrals. One of them is complete transfer of ownership. So we see in the definition, giving ownership of a specific amount of wealth. So giving ownership of amount of wealth means that I have some money, which is my zakah money, and then I find somebody who is a valid recipient of zakah, and I give that money to that person. So that will be termed as me giving ownership of wealth to that person. So now what would an example of me not giving ownership look like? Well, example of that would be, let's say I have a house, and I tell a poor person that you can live in that house for a specific amount of time and you won't have to pay rent for that house. So now I haven't actually given that person ownership of a specific thing. Similarly, let's say there's a company which, like in Pakistan, there's this big company that provides ambulance services for the poor. So now you pay zakah to them and they provide an ambulance service that if a person's poor, he can call up the number and an ambulance will come to his house and take him somewhere. Now that service which is being provided is not you actually giving ownership of something to that person. We can extend this even further and say that if you had a da'wat, right? If you had a meal, you allowed people to come. We can give this example. We're going to have iftar right now, in this masjid. So there's going to be food that's going to be set up on a table. Now, who owns that food, right? If I were to ask you, who owns that food? If you say that everybody who comes to the masjid owns that food, that means that they can come to the table and they can take all that food and just take it home with them. Because a person who has ownership of something, he is able to do whatever he wants with that item, right? But in this case, when a person comes to the masjid and we have that food on the table, it's understood that you can only take that amount of food which you're going to eat. You can take about a plate of food, a reasonable amount of food that you're going to eat. You can't take some back for home, or you can't do whatever you want with that food. So similarly, this concept is known as the concept of ibaha. This concept is known as making something permissible for somebody for a specific amount of time. So for instance, you have a house that you're renting out and you waive the rent for a person, that's ibaha, that's making that place permissible for that person for a specific amount of time. Another example of not giving ownership to somebody, and therefore it would be an insufficient method of fulfilling your zakah, is that a person owes you some money. So you know somebody, he's zakat eligible and he owes you money. And you say that I have forgiven that money which you owe me. Now, in this situation, I haven't taken something and actually given it to that person in their possession. So therefore, because transfer of ownership didn't take place, that zakah is not fulfilled. Now, in that example, there's another way of doing this, which is to give them that money in cash, and then they can give it back to you to fulfill that debt. That would be up to them. But specifically saying that I've forgiven your debt, that is insufficient. So that was one point that we had gained from this definition. Another point that we can gain from this definition is at the end it mentions that it has to be with a proper intention. So fulfilling your zakah, you have to have an intention when fulfilling that zakah. What does this mean? This means that, let's say, I had already given some money a month ago, and it went to a poor person who was eligible for zakah, but I didn't intend that I'm paying this on behalf of my zakah, which I have to pay. So therefore, is my zakah paid off? The answer is no. When you're paying that money, you have to have the intention of, I am paying zakah with this money. Do you have to tell the person that you're giving zakah money that this is actually for zakah? No, it's not necessary. That's not mentioned in this definition, and that's also not mentioned in these integrals. So therefore, you could give it to somebody, you could say this is a gift. You could give it to somebody, you could say, somebody who's eligible for zakah, right? You give them something, you say this is a gift, or this is any other name that you take for it, as long as the intention that you had was that I'm giving it for fulfilling my zakah, and that person was eligible for accepting that zakah, it will be completely permissible. One more issue which sort of relates to this is, and this happens a lot, that in families, sometimes one person in the family pays zakah on behalf of others. Let's say the father or the husband pays on behalf of the wife, or the father pays on behalf of adult children. If that person did not know that you were paying zakah on their behalf, then your paying zakah is insufficient and it won't be correct. That person should know that this person is paying zakah on my behalf. Why? Because in that case, they will have made you a third party to pay off their zakah, so therefore their intention will be found. If they had no idea and you just spent that money, you paid it in zakah, and then you tell them that, okay, I've paid your zakah, and there's two situations here. One is you tell them, I've already paid your zakah, you don't have to pay it anymore. In that situation, they will still have to pay zakah. Or the other situation is you go to them, you say, I've paid your zakah, now reimburse me that money. Right? So for instance, you can tell your son that I'm going to pay your zakah on your behalf, and then you can reimburse me the money later. That's totally fine. You can pay that money, they'll have to reimburse you. But you never told them. Then you go to your child and you say that I've paid your zakah already, and now you can just pay me the money instead of paying it to the masjid or paying it to, the whichever organization or whichever person that you're trying to pay to. In that case, it will be insufficient. Because that money, when you had paid it, you didn't pay it with sufficient permission from that person who you're paying on their behalf. So these are just a couple notes to understand with regards to the idea of intention. So now, who must pay zakah? Who are those people who on them zakah is necessary and is wajib for them to pay? There's 4 requirements that are mentioned here. First requirement is for that person to be mature. Mature means that person has passed the age of puberty, and that is defined, by the rules. It's not probably the time to go into detail with regards to that. But if a child has reached the age of maturity, whatever wealth that they own, it has to be paid in a portion of it. That portion which is necessary has to be paid in zakah. So if you have a child and you put wealth under their name and they aren't mature, they aren't baligh. You have a child 5 years old, 6 years old. People, they put certain gold, or they put certain investments, or maybe a college fund or something in that child's name. First of all, it should be important. You have to delineate exactly whose ownership that thing is. So if you're saying that it's my child's wealth, a lot of the time people think it's there for their children, or they say it's their college fund, or they say it's for them when they get married. But in reality, it's really their own. And the proof of that is they feel the freedom to spend it in a different method if they see fit. Or they might spend from that fund and then add money back into that fund. If that money is the child's, there's specific rulings with regards to the money of a child. It can only be spent on that child themselves. It can only be spent on the needs of that child themselves. And then after they become baligh or after they become mature, then they have the right to choose where that money is spent. And if they say that I'm going to spend money somewhere, then you actually don't have, well, it depends, but generally, if you're the guardian, you can give them advice, but you don't have the necessary, the authority to put a stop to that wealth or to spend it in a way that they disagree with regards to its spending. So therefore, with regards to the wealth of a child, this is something to be very careful of. right? This is something to be very specific. That is this money this child's? And if it is, then you're going to follow all the rulings with regards to the money of that child. And then also zakah won't be necessary upon that wealth until that child becomes baligh. Secondly, that person has to be sane, right? So a person who doesn't have sanity, and again, what exactly constitutes sanity? These are things which, would require a lot longer discussion. But generally, a person who isn't considered mentally sound, they don't have to pay zakat, they don't have to do hajj, they don't have to perform their salah, etc., etc. The third requirement is that they have to be affluent. Before I do that, I would say the fourth one is to be Muslim. We all can understand that. But the third requirement is that person has to be affluent. Now, what exactly qualifies a person as being affluent? So for a person to be affluent, they have to have the minimum amount of wealth. This minimum amount of wealth is different for a person having to pay zakah and a person to be eligible for zakah. This is very important. Most of the time we think that a person doesn't have to pay zakah, can accept zakah, but that's not necessarily the case, as we're going to talk about in a second. Secondly, we understand that a person only has to pay zakah after a year passes. We're not getting into that just yet. So I'm trying to make this a little bit simpler and say that the person who has to pay zakah is a person who is affluent. Now, when you have to pay zakah is after a year has passed. We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, let's just look at it from this perspective, that a person who's affluent is considered somebody who has to pay zakah. Now, what is the definition of a person who is affluent? What is the minimum amount of wealth that they have to possess to be counted as being affluent? The minimum amount of wealth is, so there's two methods of calculating the minimum amount of wealth, which is mentioned in hadith. One is calculating it based on the value of gold. The second is calculating it based on the value of silver. And in this little chart that I have provided, it's mentioned the first under nisab, it mentions that 20 dinars of gold or 200 dirhams of silver. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, both of these were about the same value. But we know that now gold is worth a lot more than silver. So because of that, now the amount has fluctuated greatly. There's also on that chart, there's the amount of the nisab in modern units. So we have grams, we have ounces, troy ounces. It's worth noting that the nisab of silver is around $500, $550. And because that is such a small amount of wealth in today's standards, the scholars have given the fatwa that especially for Western countries, so especially in a place like America, taking the silver standard or taking the silver nisab doesn't exactly make sense. Because if you say that a person who has $550 in their bank account, not only can they not accept zakah, they have to actually pay zakah. They also have to slaughter an animal for qurbani, which is like 300 of that $550. They also have to pay sadaqatul fitr. It becomes very impractical. So because of that, there's leeway with regards to this, and this is specifically why there's two nisabs mentioned in the hadith. So therefore, generally the scholars here, they say, we take the gold nisab, we take the gold standard for calculating whether a person has the minimum amount of wealth. So as we can see over there, the gold standard is 612.35 grams. And I've provided a screenshot from goldprice.org. Just search on Google for the price of gold. And I just took a screenshot. This was, I think, yesterday night. So it says April 15th at 10 p.m. New York time. Obviously, the price of gold is going to keep fluctuating. But if you have this chart with you, it'll always give you an easy way of calculating the nisab if you ever needed to. So what you would do is you would look at that grams amount that's there in that chart. So 87.49 grams. Then you go online, you find out what the value of gold is. You can see on this priceofgold.org screenshot, it says the price per gram is $63.49. So then you take that, you multiply it by 87.49 grams, and then you get the total. So the total as of yesterday night was $5,554.74. So that's mentioned there on your handout. So this is basically an easy way of calculating the nisab for gold. As long as you have that number there, which is 87.49 grams, you can always, it's just a quick Google search away, you can find out exactly what that nisab is. But to be honest, you probably won't have to really care too much about the exact nisab, right? The only reason you have to care about the exact nisab is if you had just above or just below that money and you wanted to determine if you had to pay zakah or if you didn't have to pay zakah. Generally, if you have, let's say, 6,000, you already know that's probably going to be over the nisab of gold. So about 5,500 is a good estimate for what the nisab usually is. Obviously, it fluctuates year to year. Now, once you have that, and by the way, again, if there's any questions, feel free to send it on the link that is on the website, inshallah, and we will, sorry, on the handout, inshallah, and we will answer them promptly. So now we have that minimum amount that was stipulated, $5,500 approximately. Now, what is that minimum amount calculated from? Is it just cash? Is it other things? So in this next section, I've explained that there's three portions or three types of wealth from which that minimum amount will be calculated, and then also that zakah will be paid. So these three amounts, you will put these three categories, you put them together, and if you put them all together and their value exceeds $5,500, then you have to pay zakah, and you will have to pay zakah from all of those types of wealth. Anything which isn't one of these three categories, it isn't subject to zakah, and it also isn't subject to minimum calculation. So you won't take other things which aren't from this category. Let's say, like for instance, real estate isn't mentioned here. So you won't take the value of real estate, the value of the house you own, or the value of cars you own, and say, well, that's worth more than $5,500. No, you only look at these three things. So the three categories are, number one, cash. So cash or liquid assets, I don't know exactly how to translate this. Liquid assets would include certain other, money market accounts or things like that. So that doesn't necessarily count under this. But cash is, you can summarize that as these three categories. Number one is money. So money or cash that you have, either dollars, other currencies that you have, anything that you have in any bank account, all that will count under cash. Similarly, gold or silver. So gold and silver is unique because whatever form that gold or silver has, it is subject to zakah. So whether it is used as an investment, whether it is used as jewelry, whether it is found in utensils, whether it's found in anything that is around your house, even if it's something which is in your general usage, it is still subject to zakah. How would you calculate the value of zakah for gold and silver? Let's say you have a piece of jewelry, you have a necklace, and it has some gold on it, or it has silver on it. The correct way, or the accurate way of actually gauging how much zakah is necessary is that you only have to pay zakah on the value of the gold and silver, the raw material which is in that item itself. Zakah is not necessary on diamonds, it's not necessary in rubies or precious stones or anything else. It is only necessary on the gold and silver. And if that gold is impure, then it is only necessary on the proportion of gold which is in that item itself. So the correct way of calculating this would be, let's say you have a necklace, or you have a necklace, let's say, and it has silver, and then it also has, a certain precious stone. So taking out that precious stone, what is the weight of that silver going to be? The weight of that silver is now the value of the raw material of that silver. If you take the value of the necklace itself, that's going to have the value of the raw materials. It's also going to have the value of the workmanship, right? It's going to have the value of, let's say, certain watches, right? They're very expensive. They also might have gold in them, but that gold is not what gives it its value. It could be, the brand or the company. Similarly with jewelry, with ornaments, stuff like that. So you only have to give it based on the weight of the raw material itself. And then let's say it was a gold necklace or a gold bracelet. Now, what if it was 18 carats of gold? I believe 18 carats is about 75% actual gold and 25% alloys. So therefore, let's say it was an 18 carat gold bracelet and the weight of it was 1 gram. I don't know if this is an accurate weight, but I don't think any necklace would be 1 gram, or a bracelet would be 1 gram, but just to make it easier, let's say 10 grams. It's a 10-gram bracelet and it's 18 carats of gold. And there's nothing else in that bracelet itself. Now, 18 carats of gold means only 75% of it is gold. So then only 7.5 grams of gold you actually have to pay zakah on. Okay? Sometimes this could get really confusing, really difficult. So the easiest way to do this is, instead of paying the value of the necklace itself or the value that you paid for it, because that's going to be a lot more, pay based on the weight of the whole item itself. So just take the bracelet and take the whole weight of that bracelet and just pay based on that. If most of it is gold, most of it is silver, it's going to be easier to do that regardless, right? And it's going to be more anyways, because there's stuff mixed in, you're just paying a little bit more. If you pay the value of the item itself, you're probably going to be paying significantly more for that item. Okay, so again, gold and silver, whatever form it's in, people have silverware in their houses. You can have ornaments, decorations, any form that that gold or silver has, you have to pay zakah on it. Similarly, you have to add any debts that you are owed. This is important. So any debt that somebody owes to you, you have to add. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated because there's a difference in the type of debts that a person can have. If you have a debt that you've given to somebody and you expect that they're going to pay it back, meaning you give a person a debt and they completely refuse to pay it back, you don't have any proof that they owe you money and it's been like 10 years, 15 years, you don't expect to get that money back anyways. If that's the case, then you're going to keep paying zakah on it and you're never going to actually get that money back. You're going to end up paying more zakah than the debt that's actually potentially even comes back. And you don't even have any hope that that debt will come back to you. So in that case, you don't have to pay zakah on that money. But if you give somebody a debt and they say, yeah, we're going to pay it back, or they accept the fact that they have a debt on you, or let's say you have a legal precedent, you have something in writing, you have something notarized, and you know that you can take them to court at any moment and you can demand that money back and you can get it back. That debt which people owe to you, you have to pay zakah on it every year. However, the method of doing this is, every year that you calculate your zakah, you also calculate that debt. Let's say the person owes me $10,000. The first year, it's a full $10,000. Right? So out of the $10,000, I calculate 2.5% or $250, something along those lines. Then the next year, they still haven't paid it. Still $10,000, another $250. I add that to the calculation. Then the next year, they paid $2,000 of it, let's say. Now it's $8,000. So now that amount has decreased. Until you don't receive that debt back, you don't have to actually pay the money which is due. But you have to pay it for all those years that passed. So you make the calculation every year, but it's not necessary for you to pay that money until that person comes and gives you that debt money and it's in your hand. When you have that in your hand, at that moment, you have to take out the amount of wealth which was due on its zakah per year. So somebody might ask, I've given a lot of money in debt to somebody, but I don't have the liquidity to pay it off, meaning to pay off the zakah for that, because it's a big loan, but I don't have necessarily 2.5% of that with me in hand right now. The answer is, it's not necessary for you to pay that money yet. It's only necessary for you to pay it when that debt money actually comes in your hand. Then you have to pay for everything that had passed. And one option of this is to calculate it when you get the money. So you get the money, then you calculate back all those years that that you didn't have that debt with you. When that person had owed you that money, you can calculate it back and then pay the zakah then, or you can calculate it yearly. Either way, whichever works for you. And this is also notable because in the situation that you expect them to pay back your loan, but they never end up paying it back, you don't have to pay zakah on it yearly. So if you wait until you receive that debt, then you'll be saved from the situation of the person owed me money, I expected to receive that debt, I kept paying off the zakah every year, eventually I never got the debt back. So now I've paid my zakah and I've also not gotten the debt back. So that becomes even more difficult. So it saves you from that situation because it's only necessary when you actually get that debt back in your hands. Now, merchandise. Merchandise it applies mainly for a person who owns a store, owns a shop. They have a bunch of inventory, and I used this example last time I did a zakah workshop. I'll use it again. Our good friend Jabir has a store here called Maqbool. So we're going to use his store, inshallah, as an example. So in his store, he has all these clothes that are on the racks. He has, jubbas, abayas, scarves. It's a small little advertisement for his store. But anyways, so he has all these different inventory there that's on sale. And a person's going to come and he's going to buy those things. So when the zakatable date comes, he has to take the value of all those items. All those items which are going to end up in the hands of the consumer. Will he pay the price that he paid for the item? So now you're importing a jubba from overseas, you're going to pay less for it. When you're selling it, you're going to pay more. Will he take the value that he had paid for? Will he take the value that he has it on sale for? Let's say that the thing is listed for $90. Or will he take the value that it usually sells for, which could be, let's say after a discount, I might usually sell it for $60. So the answer is, you will always look at the market value of the item. So if you have prepared clothing over here in America, you have a jubba, it's going to be worth $60. Obviously, that jubba maybe in Saudi Arabia will be worth 20, but since it's here, it's in America, the market value of that area itself is this price. So I'm going to pay that, I'm going to pay based on that amount of zakah. Meaning if I were to sell all my inventory today, what would the market value of that inventory be? What if I have raw materials? So now let's take a different example. Let's say a person has a factory, a small factory, where they sell cakes. So let's say they sell cupcakes. Now you have different raw materials which are coming in. You have flour, you have, or let's take a pizza shop, inshallah. So let's take a pizza shop, that's a good example. So now pizza shop, you have different raw materials that are coming. You have flour, you have tomato sauce, you have the ingredients. Will you pay zakah based on how many pizzas I can make from this, the value of those pizzas, or you pay based on the value of those raw materials? No. On that day, with the things that you have, let's say I have bags of flour, I will pay based on the price of those bags of flour. If I bought them wholesale, I can pay based on the value of them wholesale. If I have ready-made pizzas, I have to pay based on the value of those pizzas themselves. Anything which ends up in the hands of the consumer has to be paid zakah on. So let's say a person has a machine, right? In a pizza, you have a pizza oven. That pizza oven is not going to end up in the hands of the consumer. So therefore, it is not something that I have to pay zakah on. Let's say I have pizza boxes. I have cardboard boxes. I ordered a whole stack of them. Those cardboard boxes will be in the hands of the consumer. The pizza is put in that box and is given to the consumer. Because it will end up in the hands of the consumer, it is necessary to pay zakah on it. Okay, so this is the discrepancy between either. Now, something which relates to us more particularly. Let's say that you are, oh, and by the way, with regards to merchandise as well, the same ruling applies, that you don't technically have to pay that zakah until you actually sell that merchandise. When you sell that merchandise, you deduct that amount from the merchandise, although this is very difficult to do usually. So therefore, you just pay on that day. You know that most of your stuff is going to sell anyways. That's completely valid. But this relates more to another specific situation. That what if you're selling a house? So if one of us is selling a house, yeah. They say tax planning, right? You plan out. So this is like zakat planning. Don't put your house on the market right before your zakat day comes. Now you have to pay on, now your house is merchandise. So the value of the house. So you have your house on the market and it's your zakatable day. Now the value of that house on that day is necessary. And you have to pay that zakah when the house sells. So I have the house, it's listed on the market. I have it listed for 1.5 million, but I know that it will sell for 1.2 million. Right? The value right now is 1.2 million. You have to pay zakah based on 1.2 million. Let's say the house actually sells, I'll give a crazy number, it sells for 2 million like 6 months later. Something crazy happens, it sells for 2 million. I will pay zakah when I get those 2 million off of 1.2 million, which was the market value of the house at the time that I had that house listed for sale. So similarly, anything else like this, you have a car listed for sale. Anything which you have actively in the market, you will have to pay zakah on it. Let's say a person, he has real estate, he's a real estate investor, he doesn't necessarily have the house listed for sale, but he does invest in houses, and when he sees the right price, he'll put it up for sale, he'll sell it to somebody. So in that situation, because it's not actively for sale, it is not technically merchandise. Until, let's say, he lists it on the market, or he's going around asking people, do you want to buy my house? This is how much I'm selling the house for. Until that situation doesn't arise, he doesn't have to pay zakah on that house because it isn't technically merchandise at that specific moment. Okay, so now let's take the example of a company. So we're going to expand this out a little bit. Now a company, so take Maqbool for instance. Maqbool as a company has to pay zakah on whatever they own. Let's say 2 people own that company together. There's a joint venture, 2 people own that company. So now that zakah, or all those items, because they own 50% of that company, all those items, they're total zakah. So you take all the merchandise, the value of the merchandise is, the zakah of it is, let's say, $3,000. And the company also has liquid assets. Let's say the company has certain cash assets or certain investments. Those cash assets or investments are also necessary to be paid zakah, right? Because that was the previous category. So those cash assets, the zakah of it is $500. So the total zakah which is due on that company, 2,500 from the merchandise, 500 for the cash assets. The total zakah that is due is $3,000. Two people own that company. Those two people have to split that zakah halfway. One person is going to pay $1,500 and the other person is going to pay $1,500 in zakah. The reason I'm mentioning this is because a very good example of this is stock. When a person owns stock in a company, they own a specific portion of that company. Now, companies, they have different assets within them. First of all, you have stock in a, let's say Tesla. You have stock in Tesla. Now they're selling cars. Now they have cars that are on their lots. They have raw materials. They have steel and electronic components, all these things in the different warehouses. All of those are merchandise. Those are assets that will end up in the hands of the consumer. So it is necessary on that company to pay zakah on that total amount. A person owns a specific share of that company, even if it's very small. You own, 1/1,000,000th of that company, which is Tesla. If their zakah is whatever amount, you have to pay 1/1,000,000th of that zakah amount on that company. And to figure this out, you would have to go through their fiscal, their quarterly disclosures. You'd have to find out exactly how much cash do they have, how many investments do they have, what are their actual raw materials, what is the value of that, and you have to do all that math and say, okay, out of that, this portion I have to pay, right? However, there's another aspect of looking at stocks. The other aspect of looking at stocks is most people, they don't buy stocks with the purpose of owning a portion of the company. Most people buy stocks with the purpose of, I'm going to buy the stock and I'm going to sell it when it reaches a higher price. So in one example, the stock was a portion or share of that company. And if you're owning the stock with the purpose of having it as a share of the company, you only have to pay zakah on their liquid assets. On the other hand, the other person bought the stock, but he's treating it like merchandise. He has the stock and he's buying and selling it. So it's like he has a store and he is buying and selling goods. So he's buying and selling that stock. In that situation, you have to pay the market value of the stock itself. So the stock is worth, my total stock that I have in Tesla is worth $4,000. Now I have to pay 2.5% of that, which is like, I think $100. So $100 of the $4,000 I have to pay in zakah. Whereas if my stock was $4,000, and if you took the liquid assets of the company and whatever they owned, that's always going to be less. So let's say the portion of the zakat that I have to pay from that company, if I wasn't looking at it as a merchandise, if I was looking at it as a portion of the company, I would only have to pay $20 in zakah. So there's a difference now. If you have it with the purpose of keeping a share in the company, you only have to pay $20. If you have it with the purpose of selling that stock, you have to pay $100. So how do we determine what the intention of a person is between the two? The way to determine this, the scholars mention, is if a person is earning a significant dividend on that stock and they're keeping it to earn dividends. So some stocks, they give good dividends, right? Like Berkshire Hathaway, I don't know, some other, good stocks which every year you'll get a certain dividend off of that stock. If you have that stock for the purpose of earning the dividends, you can pay based on the zakatable assets of the company. Now, determining the zakatable assets is difficult. Who's going to go back and go through all the financial disclosures and figure out exactly what you have to pay? So the scholars mention that you can pay about 60% of the value of that stock. Because usually the liquid assets of that company don't exceed 60% of the value of that stock. Whereas if a person has the stock and he's buying and selling the stocks, he would pay 100%, meaning you're going to pay 2.5% of 100% of the stock. Whereas in the other situation, you're paying 2.5% of 60% of the value of the stock. Okay, so that was stocks. So similarly, other investments, cryptocurrency. Usually people buy and sell cryptocurrency. It's either, if you want to look at it as a form of cash, if you want to look at it as a monetary asset, then that is necessary to pay zakah. If you want to look at it as investment, that is also necessary to pay zakah because it is merchandise. You're buying and selling cryptocurrency. So again, 2.5% of the total value of that cryptocurrency on the day that is your zakatable day. Now 401ks, this is something where this is always a hot topic, and this is a question that a lot of people have. So we have to understand the 401k, at least in principle, you have to pay zakah, right? You have to pay zakah. Now, how much do you have to pay zakah? Do you pay on the zakah on that 401k? Let's say you have a certain 401k account. On this day, this is my value of my 401k account, but I technically can't take that money out. If I were to take that money out, first of all, I would be subject to my tax bracket. Say my tax bracket is 35%. So that 35% will be cut out, and then let's say there's a 10% penalty. That 10% penalty will also be cut out. So the question is, do you pay based on the total value of that 401k account that you have, or will you pay the value of it minus 45%? So 2.5% of, so if 45% are my penalties, I would pay 2.5% of 55%, right, of the value. So there's scholars on both sides, and I'm not going to tell you right now which one to follow. So you can ask a mufti and you can find out with your specific situation that how much you have to pay. However, so some people ask, that's a lot of money, how do I pay it? So the same thing applies with regards to what we mentioned about debts. You only have to pay that money when you get it. So you can pay the money that was accrued, the zakat that was accrued on your 401k, when you retire and when you get that 401k money in your account. Then you can go back and you can start paying all that zakat which is accrued. You just have to make sure that you do that math every year. There's one exception to this rule, and that exception is when you apply for a job at a company, then initially the company will, if they match your contribution. So they have a specific amount that they're matching in your contribution. They have a specific amount of years that you have to stay in the company for you to be eligible for that match. Meaning if you, what is this called? There's a word for it. Vesting, thank you. So you have a specific amount of year where the company is vesting and you have to be there for, let's say, 6 or 7 years. And if you leave the job like after 4 years, then all that money that the company had invested, the company had matched, they take it back and they don't give it to you. So in those 6 years, if your 401k account shows a specific amount, but some of that was from the company, and it's contingent on you spending 6 years in the company, you don't have to pay zakat on that. You will deduct that amount because it is not yours. When you pass the 6-year mark, you will consider that amount to be part of your 401k account. So then at that point, you'll start doing the math for either 2.5% of the whole amount or 2.5% of minus the penalties, minus the taxes. Right? But until that point, you will minus the amount that is your company's contribution is, because it's not technically yours. You haven't deserved it yet. You haven't earned it yet. And then you will take 2.5% of whatever is left. So that was basically the things which it is necessary to pay zakat on. Now, when you're calculating your zakatable assets, how much money I have that I have to pay zakat on, you can make certain deductions from that amount. The first and foremost deduction is any types of loans that you have. So actually, this is basically all three of these categories are categories of loans, and they're different categories. You have to understand them a little bit differently. Firstly, any loan which is due upon you within 1 year, you can deduct the entire amount of that loan. So let's say I have a loan that I owe somebody $5,000. I owe them now. I owe them 6 months from now, 8 months from now, 10 months from now. I can deduct that 8,000 from the value of my zakatable assets. So I have certain zakatable assets of, let's say, $7,000, but I owe $10,000 later on, about 10 months from now. Now I'm actually minus 2,000. I don't have to pay zakat. With long-term loans, the scholars mentioned you have mortgages, you have car payments. If you start deducting those, nobody would have to pay zakat because they'd be deducting $700,000, $1 million off of their value, and then everybody would just be taking zakat. So with regards to that, you take the payments that you have for an entire year. So my mortgage payment every month is $7,000. I will multiply that by 12, and then let's say that's what, like $80,000, something around that number. So $80,000 I can actually deduct from my total assets, and I don't have to pay zakat on that. Similarly for car payments. My car payments are a specific amount. This is the amount of car payments that I have to pay. Now this is for car payments. This is not for car leases. And this is also not for rent. Because these are things that you owe and a debt that you owe to somebody. With a lease, you're actually just renting the car for a specific amount of time. With rent for a house, you're just renting the house for a specific amount of time. That's not a debt that is due upon you, so you can't deduct it. So the third category in these loans that I've mentioned is any payment which is due on you at the time of paying zakat. So for instance, my zakatable date, which is set based on the Islamic calendar, it just happens to be on the 15th of this month. Now, on the 15th of this month, now most people, they pay their rent before the month. So, okay, let's do a different example. Let's say my zakatable date was the 3rd of the month. the 3rd of April. And my rent for the month of April is due on the 5th. Right? So, no, wait, let's do this again. So the month of April, yes, so the month of April, I have to pay rent for that month of April itself. And the rent is due on the 5th. I still haven't paid that rent. So the rent that you have for that month which you're paying zakah in is deductible. If you're paying rent for the next month, so you're paying rent on the 20th of the month for the next month, the month that is coming after, you will not deduct that because you already paid the rent for this month. You know, it's the 4th or 5th, I already paid the 20th of last month. So the bills that were due for this month. Similarly, if there is utilities that are due on you already, meaning half of the month has passed, I've used a certain amount of, my utility bill is $150, I've already used $75 of utilities generally because half the month has passed. That $75 can be deducted from your amount because that is a debt that you owe to somebody else. Okay, so those are the 2 examples that are mentioned on that category. Zakah is not binding on certain things. Very briefly, obviously, items in personal usage. One major exception to this. What is that major exception? Gold or silver. Good. So if you have a thing which is in your general usage, utensils or whatever it is, watches or anything which is in your house, but is made of gold or silver, you do have to pay the value of that gold or silver that is included in that thing. But generally, anything which is in your personal usage, cars, houses, furniture, clothing, all those things, you don't have to pay zakat on, nor do you value that or include that in the value of your zakat calculations, that whether it makes me above the minimum amount or not. Similarly, in a company, we talked about this. A company has machinery, right? That machinery is not subject to zakat. Why? What is the ruling for what assets in a company you have to pay zakat on? Merchandise. But what was the one principle I mentioned? If it ends up in, sorry? Good. If it's going to end up in the hands of the consumer, you have to pay zakat on it, right? If it's a raw material, or if it's something that packaging, anything, the consumer is going to have it in his hand, that thing I have to pay zakat on. But if it's something that's not going to be in the hands of the consumer, ideally your pizza oven is not going to be in somebody else's hand, that is not going to be subject to zakah. Similarly, non-growth assets. So in this I included real estate, but you do have to understand there's 2 aspects to real estate. One is I purchased the house, I'm collecting rent on it, or I own certain real estate properties. That's you don't have it as merchandise. But if I'm actually actively selling that real estate, then now that's counted under merchandise, and now you have to pay zakah. So real estate is one, I think, investment that probably is one of the rare investments that isn't subject to zakah. Most of our investments are going to be subject to zakah, as we can see, stocks, 401k, other types of investments that we have. Oh yes, one more point to point out. If you are collecting impermissible earnings from investments, so let's say a person has a savings account and they're collecting a certain amount of interest off of that savings account. So the amount that is being earned in interest is technically not yours. It's not permissible for you to take it. When you take it, you have to give that all in sadaqah. So therefore, that will also not be subject to zakat calculations. So that amount that I have is not subject to zakat calculations. And this applies for 401ks sometimes. Because a lot of the time, people who have 401ks in companies, they don't know, or the company is investing in things which are impermissible. You're not going to be giving zakah on it. Actually, you're going to be taking all the profit that you're earning in impermissible means, and you're going to have to pay that entire profit out. And that profit has to be paid to people who are zakat eligible. So it's kind of like a zakah. But at the same time, you will not count that and take 2.5% of that and pay zakah on it. You will take that entire amount, deduct it, pay 2.5% of the permissible wealth that is there, and that whole amount should be given in sadaqah. Now, this is our final point, inshallah. When must zakah be given? So, this is a point which sometimes gets a little confusing, but we're going to try to walk through this as quickly, as simply as possible, and I think it should hopefully make sense. I put 3 guidelines here. As long as you follow these 3 guidelines, pretty much you'll be able to determine whether a person needs to give zakah or not, and what date that person has to give zakah. So let's walk through this. Firstly, the person who, and by the way, we have some of these packets over here. If anybody would like to see them, you can keep them for later. They're useful, inshallah. They have useful information about zakah. So, firstly, when a person first possesses more than the minimum amount. So we talked about what the minimum amount is, $5,500 of growth assets that a person has. So now you look at all of your growth assets, things which have the potential of growth in them, and then you say that my assets on this day, it passed $5,500 for the first time in my life. So a college student graduated, he got his first paycheck. And it was a significant paycheck, or he got two paychecks, and now he's at over $5,500. That date you will mark on your calendar. Islamic day, lunar day, you will mark it on your calendar. Then, that date will remain in perpetuity. The date will never change, except in one situation. Except if that person at any point in his life becomes completely bankrupt. He reaches zero. As long as he doesn't reach zero, that date is set. Okay, so first let's look at that example when the person hasn't reached zero. That date is set. I earned my first paycheck, which was significant, on the first of Ramadan. Now, next year at Ramadan time, I will look back at my assets and I will see, do I have more than $5,500 in growth assets, which are liable to be paid zakah on? If I do, I pay zakah on it. If I don't, let's say I have $3,000 of wealth. All my wealth put together worth $3,000. I don't pay zakah. I wait till first Ramadan next year and I redo the calculations. So basically it's just one date that's set, and that date applies every year. Now many of us might be wondering, well, we never actually kept track of the first date that we were eligible for paying zakah. So the scholars mentioned, if you already set a date, stick with it and keep it, and then it will be your date henceforth, moving forward. Right? But then let's keep in mind this rule that if at any point from now moving forward, I reach bankruptcy, or in essence, I end up with no money under my name. And by the way, this is deducting debts. So this could apply, right? Like if you have 1 year debts, which are $80,000, now you have to have over $80,000 to not be considered over zero, right? So once I have, if I reach zero at any point, my date resets. Now I don't have a date anymore. But if I haven't reached zero, I will keep that date. And every year I will analyze my money on that date and I will look, do I have to pay zakah? If I have to pay zakah, well and good. If I don't, I wait till next year. What if a person reaches zero? If a person reaches zero, then your date is completely wiped out. So you've just started from, point number one. Now you will wait till your wealth reaches the minimum amount, just like you did in the beginning. Once you reach the minimum amount for the first time, set that date, mark it on your calendar, and now exactly 1 year from then, you might have to pay zakah. Hopefully that was clear and that was relatively simple. This is something confuses a lot of people, and it is can be difficult to follow with sometimes, but this is a general rule, and I think those three principles there should summarize. So if you forget, open up that packet, keep it with you, keep it safe, inshallah. It has useful information, and you can always look back at those three rules and follow that guideline, inshallah. I've also put a chart of an example individual who has to pay zakah, just to give you an example of what it would look like. And when we did this in our fiqh class, we had 5-6 charts of different examples. We went over it. We don't have the time to do that right now, but this is just a basic example of a person who has to pay zakah. So if you look at that chart, you see at the first of Dhul Hijjah, he has $5,000. And you can see the nisab line. And notably, the nisab line fluctuates because that's how usually nisab works, right? Usually the value of gold fluctuates. It'll go up and down. So we can see on the first of Muharram was the first time in that person's life ever that they reached exactly at nisab. Right, they reached $5,450, and on that day, the value of gold was $5,450. Right, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. Right, it's okay if there's a best guess here, but that was the date that he reached nisab. So now he marked that date on his calendar, the first of Muharram. We can see within that year. So I put a line there just to mark that date. Within that year, it went above the nisab. It also went below the nisab, but that doesn't matter. On the first of Muharram of the year following, we can see that he has $5,700 and nisab is $5,560. So you can see there's a chart, there's a table at the bottom which shows the value of the nisab and his wealth. So now his money that he has, is it over nisab or not? Yes, it's over nisab. So therefore he has to pay 2.5% of how much? $5,700. Okay? What if he had on that first of Muharram, he had only $3,000? Well, he wouldn't pay zakah. He would just wait till the following year on the first of Muharram and he would redo the math. If any time in that period, so you can see his wealth went over nisab or under nisab, but it didn't reach zero, notably. If it had reached zero, then what happens? Then it resets. To what date? Next time he reaches nisab. So then he's going to wait till he reaches nisab. Then from then, does he pay zakah the day he reaches nisab? No, he waits another year. Good, mashallah. So that is everything we have here, inshallah. There's more information on the paper itself, but this is kind of an overview of how we pay zakah and how to take out zakah. The rest of the information is more FYI. For anybody who's interested in more information, inshallah, we have this fiqh class. It's ongoing, and we're going to have it again next year. We cover, fasting in 7 weeks, and we cover, zakah in 4 weeks or 3 weeks. So you'll be able to get more information there, inshallah. Now, we have a number of questions, so I have to get to that, inshallah, before time runs out. So the first question is, very quickly, if your house has a loan, the question is it's not entirely explanatory. So it says, if your house has a loan and your profit for a 1.3 million house is 600,000, I'm not sure. If it was anybody here, they can explain it. Let me just finish these because we had a method of asking questions. It's on the slide. So there's a website there. I just need to get through these questions because time is running out. What if merchandise listed for sale ends up for selling a lot less later? For a $1.5 million house ends up selling for $750,000 later. So good question. So what do you guys think? What would the ruling there be? Value of the house when? Good. So the value of the house on your zakatable date. So it sold for 750,000 later. That just means that the day it sold, it was worth 750,000. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the day was your zakatable date. It was worth 1.5 million. So you pay based on the value of the zakatable date that you have. I mean, this assuming somebody owns the house and he's selling it. Correct. If you had a debt outstanding on the house, correct, you'd have to deduct that. Can you deduct taxes from the value if you were to sell that stock? So in this case, I haven't heard anybody say that you would deduct taxes for the stock. So I understand you have, there's a capital growth, or what is that? Capital gains tax, and that could be significant. But I haven't heard of anybody, wallahu alam, that says you would deduct the taxes, the capital gains taxes off of stock. Rather, you would pay zakah on the total value of that stock. Can you deduct loans you have taken from someone, but there's no date on when you will pay it back, so it could be more than a year later? Yes. Technically, the way loans work in Islam is that you have to pay. You have to pay when you have money. There is a concept of dayn mu'ajjal, which is you have a set date. So that is kind of superfluous. But if you've taken a loan from somebody, that's totally valid. What that means is, when I have the money, I'm going to pay you back. So that is considered a debt which is due on you at this specific moment, and then you would be able to deduct the entire amount because you have to pay it at that specific moment. Okay, scenario: $3,500 mortgage monthly, and your total money in your bank account was $42,000. You have no other financial assets. So they've left me to do the math here. So $3,500 times 12 is 42. 42 exact? No, 40,000. 5 times 12, 7,000, 35. Yeah, 42. Okay. So this is 42,000. Yes. So basically you're at zero. Oh, okay. It says, does it mean so-and-so is at zero? Yes. You're at zero and you would wait for a new zakat date. Correct. Okay. So those are those questions. Any other questions very quickly before we should break for study?
Yeah, I had one. You know how some of these like Islamic relief, they collect as a part or some of these organizations. Now they take a percentage. I didn't know that they take a percentage of the zakat money, but they say that it's for the people that distribute the zakat.
Yes.
How does that work?
Yes. So there was a whole extra section in our talk. But I had a feeling we wouldn't have time to cover this. That's a lengthy topic in terms of what organizations and. Yes, so the question is with regards to an organization which takes a certain cut out of the zakat money for administrative costs. So just to answer the question briefly, that's not permissible. So the entirety of that zakat money has to reach the people who are valid recipients of zakat. Some organizations do it such that they say this is a recommended, you add on to it, that this is how much you should add on to cover our administrative costs. So for us to distribute your zakah, pay 5% extra. So that money you should pay in sadaqah, not in zakah, right? But the administrative costs cannot be deducted. Now the question is why, that's a lengthy discussion, inshallah, for another time.
They say that 12% that they collect from their zakat money is for the people that are.
I understand that. So that's the discussion that certain scholars have. What's mentioned in the Quran, in the verse of the Quran, is that the people who work actively in paying the zakah, they can accept zakah. However, it's subject to a lot of requirements, right? And it specifically relates to our situation. All of our scholars are unanimous on the point that it relates to a situation where that person was deputed on behalf of the Islamic government themselves, right? Rather than any organization. And this can lead to a lot of issues, right? And this is a door that we definitely don't want to keep open. And we see that, so much misappropriation of zakat funds. If you say that an organization can take zakat funds, then there is no hisab, right? Whereas a person who is deputed by the Islamic government, they're only allowed to take that amount which fulfills their needs. Whereas an organization, they could be using it for marketing. They could be using it for, for their IT or for all these other needs that they have, transportation, all these things which the money doesn't even go to an individual, which is the first and foremost requirement of zakah, that it goes in the hands, transfer of ownership, right? We talked about this at the beginning. So I've been told that Al-Misbah, inshallah, that's the one that the masjid recommends. So Al-Misbah here in Central Valley, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. If anybody has any other questions, you can come to me, inshallah, at the time of iftari or after. I'll be here for a little bit, inshallah. I'll be happy to answer your questions. If you need my phone number, you can take that as well, and then you can answer them. So, so the time is pretty much